Buongiorno.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd rather say good day because there's still light out there. One of the most important subject matter at all meetings, this included, is the speculation that we keep making on education and on the subject of subsidiarity. Fashions change, but at times there are things that are to be highlighted, especially at a time of crisis. We are going through indeed a deep crisis, and the reaction is ever more urgently required, and a reaction as a solution to the problems of the people. The government has provided with guidelines for the reforms of the third sector, for the non-profit sector. Over the past few years, we've met up with people worldwide that have opened up their minds and that have analyzed questions in greater detail. Often people refer to the mixed combination of public and private and social economy, but there are people, as I was saying, that have thought about something even more important, especially at a time of little public funding, i.e., how can you finance the third sector with new solutions, perhaps bringing about some kind of revolution. Truly enough, the non-profit sector has to find resources with finances that are provided for by the state or by private donors. But with a more modern perspective, something else can be thought about, something which may be defined as welfare for the common good, finance actually for the common good, i.e., some kind of financial tools with some kind of return on investment referred to the social common good, so that you can have return investments with returns, and so that the non-profit sector can be actually referred to as a component, a part of the economy. This might be quite new to many of you. I remember that at the beginning of a new millennium, a book was published which is the halved non-profit, because the thing that a non-profit business or the non-profit organization could yield returns was something very strange, because non-profit to be such was considered only as something based on the voluntary work, generating no returns. And now a few years have gone by, but nothing has actually changed, because we still very much believe that whenever profits are not generated, whatever is organized as a business with people working with a balance sheet might not be included in what we know as non-for-profit. But anyway, this is not right, because social businesses do exist elsewhere, so that funds are given and returns are yielded. This is obviously quite important, because if we reform the non-profit sector and we adopt a guideline, but we don't talk about who's going to provide for the money, well, then obviously it won't last for long. It won't be very momentous. So, this is what has been happening over the past few years. Much lip service is being paid for the non-for-profit sector, but then nothing is actually achieved. Well, we have come across a number of people that have speculated, that have been all getting organized along these lines, that have been working along these lines. So today we shall hear something that we might learn from. That's why we have invited Letizia Salamon, whom, as you know, is a theoretician non-profit with his studies at Hopkins University. He has made censuses of the non-profit industry, looking at the commitment on the side of voluntary workers, on the number of workers involved, on the money generated, and well, he's going to talk to us about the new frontiers of this. And he has actually developed this idea of the finance for the common good, a finance made up of investments and returns. After him, we're going to give the floor to Mrs. Letizia Moratti. We could say many things about her past appointments. She was the president of RAI. She used to be a minister. She's has always been committed personally throughout her career and throughout her life, has been committed to the Patrignano Foundation. She's a co-founder of the foundation of Patrignano, and she has never confined herself just to work in that, but also to carry out studies on that. And she's going to refer to us about the important occasions that have been organized within the European Union to talk about this. So Lester Salamon is going to start off, and then we're going to hear that there's something new ahead of us. And then we're going to hear from Marco Morganti, who's the CEO of Banca Prossima. This is a bank, and before these speculations started, they started again setting up a bank which is fully devoted to this specific sector, establishing links with social businesses, with social organizations. Banks can give you money, but obviously they don't give it for free. We're talking about a bank, and he will talk about again the role that the bank can play. Most important speakers, a very interesting subject matter. And this is a way really to lay emphasis on the ends of the earth, on the those who are the outcasts, marginalized in society. So the non-for-profit certainly is going to help those that start at the ends of the earth to get to the center. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Lester for him to talk about these subjects. Thank you, Lester. And by the way, I'd like also to thank you all for being here, all those in attendance. Thank you very much for being amongst us.
Joe, it's an absolute delight for me to be here again. This is my second opportunity to come to a meeting, and I never cease to be amazed at the scale of the activity and the incredible organization. And so I salute all of you, and I say congratulations to the organizers of this remarkable yearly event. I'm sure I don't need to tell this group that we're in a global situation in which government support and philanthropic support is barely growing and in many places is in decline, whereas the problems of poverty and ill health and environmental degradation continue to increase day after day. And what this calls for is a new way of financing social purpose activity. And what I want to talk to you about tonight is what I think is a revolution going on in the financing of social purpose activities all around the world. And so I bring you maybe some good news. This is not a revolution that is complete. It's still in a very embryonic stage, but I think it's a way to offset some of the reduction in government support and some of the lagging in philanthropic support by mobilizing and leveraging the resources in the private investment community, which is, after all, where all of the wealth in our societies lies. So what I want to do is 5 things. I want to briefly explain what's happening, in my view, in this field. And I think it's quite dramatic what's happening. I want to briefly explain why I think it's happening and happening now, because this is how we tell whether it will survive. Thirdly, I want to describe some efforts that I've been making to make sense of this phenomenon that I believe is underway in the financing of social purpose activity, and introduce you to some materials that I have recently produced. Fourthly, I want to talk about some of the remaining obstacles, because this is a revolution that is not complete and that requires a lot of work on the part of all of us. And then finally, I want to talk about what our next steps should be. How do we make sure that this interesting possibility, this new way of financing social purpose activity, can grow and become a really major way of solving the problems that we're facing in the world. So let me begin with the first point. What's happening? So one thing that is happening is that we are going through what seems to be something that, if I were a physicist, I could describe as a big bang, a gigantic explosion in the world of social purpose finance, the emergence of a whole host of new actors and new tools that we've never seen before operating in social purpose activity. There are organizations like Bridges Ventures in the UK, which is a social purpose venture fund, or Blue Orchard Investors in Switzerland, which is a equity fund, or Compagnia di Sanpaolo in Torino here in Italy, which is a conversion foundation, a foundation that came out of the privatization of your savings banks, as I'm sure all of you know, or Avishkar International in India, which is generating equity capital to invest in small and medium enterprises in the rural parts of India, or Triodos Bank in the Netherlands, or TechSoup Global, which is using a barter arrangement to deliver technology to nonprofit organizations around the world. These are all the new world of social purpose finance that is sprouting up with enormous ingenuity and significant resources all over the world. What lies behind these developments, this explosion, this big bang, is a set of significant shifts in how we go about financing social purpose activity. In particular, 4 important shifts are underway. First of all, we're moving beyond grants as a way to finance nonprofits and other social purpose activity. Grants are a form of assistance in which you give away the money. Once it's given away, it's gone. Other parts of our economies and societies have found more efficient ways to use their resources, to leverage their resources. And so too, these are entering the world of nonprofit and social purpose activities. And so we're seeing the use of loans and loan guarantees and equities and bonds and securitization. These are all words very familiar in the world of finance, but very unfamiliar in the world of social purpose activity. Secondly, we're moving beyond bequests as the way to build foundations and charitable endowments. We're emerging a new phenomenon that I've called philanthropication through privatization, which Italy has been a leader in through the creation of your foundations of banking origin. But this is going on around the world, not only in Italy. So thirdly, we're moving well beyond foundations as the source of revenue for social purpose activity. We're seeing the emergence of loan funds and equity funds and various kinds of securitization enterprises that are channeling investment money, and not simply charitable money, into social purpose activity. A whole host of these organizations that I was speaking about before. And then finally, we're moving beyond cash as ways of assistance, and therefore we're emphasizing more the power of volunteering, but also a whole variety of barter arrangements that are bypassing cash connections and connecting people up directly to trade various kinds of services, to trade various kinds of products, and to use barter and the internet as a way to move resources. And so what's developing is a new paradigm, the central concept of which is the concept of leverage. Leverage is the vehicle that allows a weaker source of power to move a stronger source of power. It's what allowed Archimedes to say that if he could find a place to stand and a lever in his hand, he could move the earth. This is leverage, and leverage can be applied to the world of social purpose activity just as it can be applied to the world of for-profit activity. And that's what's going on. And so what all is happening in this new paradigm? If we compare traditional philanthropy to what I call the new frontiers of philanthropy, it has many different shifts that are involved. First of all, we're moving from reliance on foundations and individuals as the sources of revenue to a whole variety of investment funds that are collecting capital and using it to invest in social purpose activities. We're moving beyond grants, moving beyond operating income to focus on investment capital, a different type of capital that focuses on the long-term growth of activities that can begin to generate a profit, that can begin to generate the social good over the long run. We're moving from grants to a whole host of diverse investment vehicles, capital tranches, bundles of financing, some of which is provided by foundations, but others of which are provided by different investment houses with different levels of risk and return. We're moving from just supporting nonprofits to supporting as well a whole variety of social ventures, different kinds of enterprises such as your social cooperatives in Italy, similar entities emerging all around the world. We're moving from a focus on social return alone to a focus on social and financial return, organizations that have the capability to produce social good but also return the investment dollars to the investors. We're moving from a world in which leverage was very limited because grants were used to a world in which we are finding ways to get expanded leverage. And we're moving from a focus on outputs as the way to measure progress and success to a focus on outcomes. What is the actual outcome of these social purpose activities? And so there's a new ecosystem emerging. The beneficiaries are still the same, but supporting the beneficiaries is a whole new set of actors. There are new sources of funds coming from the investment side of the economy. There are new actors that are mobilizing these funds and making them available, many of which I had on the chart before. They're using new tools to bring these resources to bear on social and economic problems. They're using new agents, not simply nonprofits, but a whole variety of social cooperatives, social ventures, and finally bringing their resources to bear on social and economic problems. So why is this happening? Second point I want to touch on. There are both demand factors and supply factors at work, and I will very briefly discuss them. The demand factors, some of them have been around for a long time. We've had social problems and environmental problems for a long time. They have intensified. We're living in what one environmentalist, Lester Brown, calls the new inferno. But we're now facing these problems with limited resources. But we're also facing these problems with the rise of a group of social entrepreneurs who are bringing to the attention of potential funders concrete ideas for how to solve these problems in a workable way. And those demand factors are being reinforced by a set of supply factors. We had a number of early responders who began to innovate, both in our country and in your country. And I would call attention to Prossima Bank here in Italy as an example of an early responder beginning to utilize the market to promote social purposes. We have a whole new set of concepts, particularly this concept that was popularized by an Indian economist by the name of Prahalad, who wrote a very important book in the early 1990s called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And what Prahalad was able to show is that there are ways to reduce the cost of a whole host of products needed by people at the bottom of the pyramid in ways that are saving a lot of money for those people and still able to provide a profit to people who find products and find ways to market that can serve that population at a much lower cost. And this has energized a whole host of social entrepreneurs who are coming up with wonderful ideas for creating, for example, $3 a pair of glasses so that children in India can remain in school, or solar panels that are extremely inexpensive and allow farmers in African desert areas to have refrigeration units at a very low cost. And the number of these ideas just goes on and on. We have a whole host of new players, groups of people who earned their incredible fortunes through the dot-com technology revolution, and who at a very early age have begun to turn their attention to philanthropy, but who want to bring to this world a kind of investment focus, and therefore have brought new ideas and new ways of acting into this field. I think in a way the financial crisis has helped to trigger this whole set of developments, because it shook people into the realization that maybe the most important thing in life was not accumulating capital, getting richer and richer, but finding meaning in life. And they stimulated a lot of people to begin turning their attention to putting some of their capital into some of these social purpose activities. So this is a phenomenon that has had a whole host of factors explaining it. And so what I want to do now is turn to the question of how do we get our arms around this? And I have begun to work on this very seriously, and have produced 2 books, one of which I can barely pick up. It's called New Frontiers of Philanthropy. It is the Bible of this new phenomenon. It's a very, very heavy book, full of insight, but we were smart enough to take the introduction and put it out as a very slim volume. And I think there are flyers somewhere in this room that any of you who are interested, it's available on Amazon. And we're going to do a book signing event tomorrow in the library at, I think, 2 o'clock for those of you who are interested. What this book does, this book and its partner, Leverage for Good, which is the introduction, it breaks this world that we are experiencing into 2 categories of phenomena. One are a set of actors that have emerged on the world scene, and the second is a set of tools. The terminology is not the kind of terms that you would expect in a book on philanthropy. The actors have names like capital aggregators, secondary markets, social stock exchanges, foundations as philanthropic banks. And the tools have names that are familiar to the world of finance, but very unfamiliar to the world of philanthropy. Terms like loans, credit enhancements, bonds, securitization, equity investments, quasi-equity. These are strange words, but this is the language that we're all going to have to learn. So let me take a look at some of the boxes here and just introduce them to you. Who are they and what are they doing? So let's begin with the capital aggregators. Capital aggregators, get back there. These are the entities that are assembling financial resources for investment in social purpose activity. And they take a variety of different forms. Some of them focus on equities, that is, purchasing stock in companies. Some of them focus on loans, and some of them do bonds. We estimate that there are something on the order of 3,000 such capital aggregators that have been created globally, and that they sit on about $300 billion of capital at the present time, and it continues to grow. These are organizations like I mentioned before, Avishkar, Triodos Bank, Blue Orchard, a whole variety of new financial institutions that have focused their attention on mobilizing capital from high net worth individuals, from everyday people, some cases from foundations, and concentrate on mobilizing and channeling this capital into promising social ventures. So pouring money into the development of these $3 glasses or these $100 solar panels that never existed before and that require investment in order to take off. So there are thousands of these now emerging around the world. Or a second set are so-called secondary markets. Secondary markets exist to refresh the makers of loans. Once an organization, a bank, or any other institution makes a loan for 5 or 10 years, it uses up its capital and it can't make more loans. And so one way to refresh the loan pool is through a process called securitization, where you pull them into bundles and sell bonds that allow investors to buy the loans, and the bond sale proceeds go back to the original investor. To give you an example, Habitat for Humanity, a very well-known international development agency focusing on constructing low-income housing for poor people around the world. Habitat uses volunteers to build the housing, but they still have to buy the land, they still have to buy the equipment, they still have to buy the facilities, and the agencies that make up the Habitat network use up the loan money that they have in order to purchase these materials. And when they use it up, they can't build any more low-income housing. And so Habitat has created something called the Flex Cap program, in which they buy up the loans that have been made by their affiliates. They sell the loans to investors. They get the capital and give it back to the original agencies, the Habitat for Humanity agencies, allowing them to make new loans. And this becomes a very significant process in any investment process, particularly something that requires long-term loans such as home loans. And so we have seen a whole host of secondary markets. For example, Habitat for Humanity, as I indicated, Bangladesh Rural Action Committee, BRAC, a major Bangladeshi nonprofit, recently floated a $180 million bond issue to finance a secondary market for microcredit investors. And this is using the techniques of the market to channel money, capital, into social purpose activities. A third example are social stock exchanges, another new invention that is recently appeared. You may be familiar with the European Climate Exchange, which is selling carbon permits to achieve reductions in carbon emissions. That is an enormous market already, on the order of $85 to $90 billion as of 2011. The global carbon credit market is a $142 billion market. It is a stock exchange using emission credits as a way to reduce emissions of carbon. And the same idea is now stretching into this world of social ventures. And so in Singapore, there has been created something called the Impact Investment Exchange, connected to the Singapore Stock Exchange, but operating as a special focused exchange to channel funding and capital directly into social ventures that would otherwise have difficulty attracting and securing investment capital. One other that I'll point to of particular interest to me is a set of foundations that have begun to operate as philanthropic banks. These are foundations that have begun to move outside of the world of grant making. And so what they have begun to do, they've broken down what has long been referred to as the Chinese wall between the investment side of foundations and the grant side. They've begun to tap into the asset base of foundations for mission purposes. And they've gone well beyond grants and begun to use alternative tools of action. And they've gone beyond what in our country are called program-related investments. You have several foundations in this country that have begun to enter this world of operating as philanthropic banks. I would mention Fondazione CRT in Torino. I would mention Caraplo Foundation, which has significantly entered this realm. In the United States, we have a foundation called the Heron Foundation that is devoting 100% of its asset base to this kind of social investment. Esme Fairborn, another foundation in the UK, which also in the same operation. And then finally, there's a whole emergence of these so-called conversion foundations. These are foundations that have come out of the privatization of some publicly owned or publicly controlled asset. And the entire network of Italian foundations of banking origin, a huge transformation of the foundation community in this country. We've now identified 539 foundations around the world that have come out of the privatization of some public enterprise or some publicly controlled asset. They have a total of 135 billion of assets, never before visualized. And we think that this is a option that countries that are sitting on assets, thinking about privatizing them, could provide a resource that could finance social purpose activity if the civil society sector gets its act together and basically says, if we're going to have privatization, whether we want it or not, let's find a way to capture some of the resources for the people and put them in a charitable endowment that can support the people over the long run. So those are some of the actors. I won't go through all of them, but you can see that there's a very rich, inventive phenomenon going on around the world. And the same thing is true when it comes to the tools. We have a whole variety of tools, and let me just focus on two of them. One of them is referred to as micro-insurance. It turns out that less than 3% of low-income people in the world's poorest countries have any access to insurance. And when you don't have insurance, you get very conservative. And therefore, the absence of insurance creates limited innovation. People are not willing to take a risk. Well, the International Labor Organization has created something called the Micro Insurance Innovation Facility. And it's worked with insurance companies to create micro insurance products that can be marketed to the bottom of the pyramid. And very inventive schemes, again, have emerged to facilitate this. So, for example, one of my favorites is a program that the UN World Food Program came up with, in which they get Ethiopian farmers to work on irrigation projects, and they pay them with flood insurance. And so they use the time of these farmers to do things that reduce the risk of flood, and then they pay them off with flood insurance in case the flood still occurs. These are just one or two examples of how you use microinsurance. And then one other tool that's gotten a lot of attention is social impact bonds. This is a way to monetize the savings to government from intervention programs that are preventative rather than waiting to problems to occur. The way this works is that the best example is one in the UK where the government agreed to pay off a group of financiers who were willing to invest in programs that would reduce repeat offenders in the prison system. If the innovation succeeds, the government will pay off the investors with a 10 or 12% return. So all the risk is taken by the investors. They put up the money, they create support for a preventive program, they measure the results, and if they succeed, the government will pay them off. And in this program, it probably costs 1 billion British pounds to achieve about a 50 billion British pound reduction in the cost of the lifetime imprisonment of the people who are first-time offenders. If you can reduce the recidivism rate, the repeat rate, You can save enormous amounts of money in prison costs. The trouble is that governments are frequently unable to pay for those upfront programs. This is a way to get the investors to take the risk and for the government then to pay off the cost of the program and save itself a tremendous amount of money. So this is an important set of developments, but it's not without its obstacles. It's not without its shortcomings. It's not without its problems. And let me just touch on a few of them and then say a word or two about what I think needs to happen to get over these obstacles. The obstacles are several, and I'll touch on them very quickly. The first thing is that no good deed goes unpunished, as we all know. And so too, this wonderful new idea of new ways of financing social purpose has a downside. And that downside is that it tends to emphasize the support for service programs. And service programs, of course, are important. We need more education, we need better housing, we need more health care. But there's another set of nonprofit activities that takes the form of advocacy, of mobilization of people. And I often reflect on the fact that in the United States, the civil rights movement, which was a very important change agent in the United States, it didn't build any schools, it didn't build any housing, it didn't do any worker training, and yet it probably had more impact on the African American population of our country than any service program together. And so if we focus only on services, as this kind of new frontiers is doing, we may lose something quite important in the nonprofit sector. So we have to be careful about that. Secondly, there's a very significant challenge of coming up with measures of the social impact. Here we are using financial vehicles that are seeking a financial return. And we know that the measurement of financial return is well developed. But the measurement of the social return that we're hoping to come from those financial investments, that's not so well developed. And therefore we run the risk of having the financial returns dominate the investment decisions. And so we have to improve the measurement of the social return. A third issue is that this new development, which is quite big, is still a boutique business in the world of our financial capital markets. It's 12 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion a year in capital markets that even in the US alone are 14 or 20 trillion dollars. And so we still are in an uphill climb, and the climb is slow. A fourth issue is the issue of what's called deal flow. There's more money available for investment in social purpose than there are workable deals at this point. And so we have a whole serious problem of trying to mobilize and incentivize and create new ideas for social purpose activity. And then finally, this field has been informed by a number of comforting assumptions that traditional market return rates are going to be possible. Well, it's probably not the case. Or that this can substitute for government. Again, very likely not the case. Or that traditional philanthropy is history and is not going to be around. Again, not likely to be the case. So what are our next steps? I think there are some significant ones. I think there is a very significant still task of visualizing what is happening in a conceptual way and understanding it, grasping it, seeing its potential. There's an important task of publicizing these developments so that people can understand them. There is significant need, continued need for incentivizing them. They will not happen on their own. They need to be incentivized both by government and by philanthropy. We have to deal with the problem that the organizations we want to try to help are not equipped to take advantage of these new investment vehicles. And so we have to capacitize them. We have to improve their capacity to deal with these financial instruments. And then finally, we have to get about the task of actually making the investments and taking advantage of them. So to conclude, the enormous challenges confronting the global community at the present time. We have failed states, we have international terrorism, we have global warming, we have persistent poverty, deforestation, water shortages, the list goes on. The new tools and actors that I've been describing are not a panacea for solving these problems, but for me it's hard not to see them as one of the more promising developments in an otherwise pretty dismal scenario of lagging resources and resolve. Though not without their problems, I think they hold the promise of bringing significant new resources into efforts to solve the world's problems and of unleashing new energies and new energies. And so it's perhaps not surprising that these developments have even found their way into the consciousness of an aging, now retired conservative pope whose 2009 encyclical Caritas in Veritate pointedly acknowledged that the traditional valid distinction between nonprofit-based companies and nonprofit organizations can no longer do full justice to reality or offer practical direction for the future. And so here is the Pope in this encyclical calling attention to this merger that's underway between the for-profit sector and these nonprofit social purpose activities. And I think the developments that I've been describing provide powerful support to this observation. But at the same time, they underline a caution that the Pope also entered in that encyclical, that we have to remain vigilant that this new composite reality, as he called it, that's emerging, while not excluding profit, make sure that profit is used, as Benedict put it, as a means for achieving human and social ends. And so we can't lose sight of the ends. And this is the hope that the New Frontiers of Philanthropy holds out for us, and that this book and the work that I'm doing is seeking to advance. And at a time of diminished resources and diminished expectations, it is, I think, for better or worse, one of the most promising hopes that we have. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Giorgio Vittadini. Let me thank also the meeting for inviting me to certainly to listen to Professor Salamon, who's a most distinguished authority in this subject matter. And thank you also for inviting me to contribute my own ideas on the subject. I'd like to start off where Professor Salamon ended in his conclusive remarks. We are certainly facing a work crisis, a deep crisis. I'd like to quote just a few figures so as to give you the size of this crisis. Next year, the Millennium Objective are going to get to the deadline, and we are far away from reaching the objective that we had set for ourselves. Well, perhaps in certain areas, such as, for example, in the fight against malaria and tuberculosis, we've done something or we are about to reach them, but certainly we haven't reached the objective of millennium in extending literacy worldwide, in the fight against death mortality. As a matter of fact, in terms of a fight against child mortality, we have 87 per 1,000. We wanted to get down to 29, and we are just down to over 50. So we're still far from reaching the objectives. The Bureau International du Travail, the International Labour Organization, refers to data before 2007, and we are doing even worse. So 50 unemployment is pretty high, and we're going to have as many as 2.5 million more unemployed people per year. These are global figures, of course, and this is going to happen over the next few years. So worldwide, this is a deep structural crisis. This is a crisis that, on the one hand, again, affects the whole world, and on the other hand, we should also say that it is being experienced very, very harshly in Europe. In Europe, as I was saying, we're going through a stage of recession. This indeed is not just a problem for Italy. Italy, as we know it for sure, is experiencing dire crisis, but this is so again throughout the continent in Europe. Faced with such a crisis, we still have to come up with answers. Frau Merkel is often quoting important figures. Europe accounts for 7% of the world population, 25% of the GDP, absorbing over 50% of the welfare worldwide. How will we be able to support this welfare with a dwindling population in Europe and with a GDP that is getting down itself? These, unfortunately, are the facts. All research carried out on the welfare are telling us that there's a gap between the demand for welfare, the demand for services, and the provision of public services, the delivery of such services. In Italy, this gap is equal to some 30 billion euro and up to 80 billion euro in Germany and 170 billion euro in UK. So this is the gap in terms of failing resources for the welfare in these European countries. So, well, I believe that this is certainly the most important subject matter. Obviously, environmental sustainability is very important as well, but this problem with welfare is really causing and is going to cause even worse social tensions unless something is done to support the welfare that we are used to, not even thinking about enhancing it. So new answers are to be found, new solutions are to be identified. And such solutions are to be found along the directions that Professor Salamon pointed out. So basically, we have to be more active and we have to find new tools. Initiatives have been launched worldwide that perhaps are to get more interconnected. An important initiative started up in Europe after years during which Europe was more looking at competition, competitiveness, the monetary union, and so on and so forth. Based on the thrust by Commissioner Tagliani Andor, the social market economy was relaunched, and this is very much the basis on which Europe was built. This is part and parcel of the vision with which Europe was established, and this vision actually had been lost over the years. This is a vision, again, of Europe which is based on solidarity, generosity, support amongst countries, with important leaders that brought forward such vision that unfortunately, again, had gone somewhat lost. So based on the thrust by Commissioner Barnier, Andor, and Tagliani, the idea of social market economy was relaunched through an initiative, the Social Business Initiative indeed, that went through different stages and got to an important step with a statement that was voiced in Strasbourg in January last, whereby governments are fully pledged to support social economy, social market economy, and the European budget has been equipped with funds, again, for social businesses, for social purpose activities. So a lot of money will be set aside for social purpose activities, social funds, so as to give new energy to what we call as the third sector. And this is certainly most reassuring. Yet, we still have to see what the Commission is going to look like in the near future, so that we get basically the endorsement by the newly appointed Commission again to actually carry forward those promises that were made. And there's a second important movement, which is the task force of the G8, G7, that was strongly promoted by Prime Minister Cameron during the 6-month rule of United Kingdom, and this committee is working not just with the G7 and G8 countries, but also with other countries that are observers. And this committee is cooperating with national advisory boards so as to draft a document that has already been debated in London June last, which is about to be presented on September the 5th, the coming month. So an official presentation of the whole work that was carried out by the number of national advisory boards will again be made on September the 15th with one objective, that of promoting an environment that is encouraging for the such new tools. You probably follow the concept of Professor Salamon in his slides, and as you've seen, the first slide referred to the Big Bang. So there's a combination of different players that are to be organized. A more orderly framework has to be put together so that each with their own differences can play a role in a more orderly way with a better harmonization again. Each of the player will keep its specific features, but still there is to be some kind of organization for the different players, again, to coexist and to establish some kind of dialogue so as to have tools that may be used by more, because whenever a social impact bond is set up, you have to have the government that provides its support, and then you also have to have a foundation that takes up the first part of the venture risk, and then otherwise you never find an investor taking up the rest of the risk, basically. So you have to have different players again act together in this ecosystem, and this is an important work which is being carried out at the moment. An important step, again, as I was saying, is going to be September the 15th, when this statement is going to be made, with this declaration is going to be made. There's another important event which is happening. There's another important movement which is called the Movement for the Positive Economy. Jacques Attali started it. It is now getting more international. A conference was held in Italy recently, based very much on this movement. And this movement has two main features that I believe are most interesting. One is the attempt to provide information on indicators different from the GDP, and I shall go back to this. The second important element is that of including among the company indicators some kind of incentives so that companies may invest long term, and this is true for companies as well as for holding financial institutions. So whenever you talk about social finance, so obviously you also have to understand that you have to have a long term, that you have to have patient capitals, as we term them. You have to expect, basically, you have to anticipate returns, but only in the long term. So you have to put together holdings, financial buildings that can invest again without requiring again short-term returns, because the anxiety for short-term returns is what caused all the problems that we had to come to terms with, and whose consequence we're still paying for very dearly. The movement set up by Jacques Attali at this international forum, and Monsieur Attali decided to have it in Italy, by the way, and during this forum, 10 actions were identified that have been presented to the government so as to bring about some kind of socially acceptable economy an economy which in the long term is sustainable, providing those welfare solutions that are in demand. So we talked about, for example, family policies, promoting the growth of population, and then I go back to Merkel's data. Europe only accounts for 7% of the world population. So if you have political or family policies promoting the birth of children, well then we would have certainly a positive consequence. Financial tools might also be created so as to provide public services next to the state, because the state is finding it ever more difficult to do so. So if on the one hand we have restrictions in terms of public finance available to deliver services, on the other hand we should have again private entities delivering the very same services. So new tools are to be identified, new players are to be identified who can act on behalf of the state. Mike Morganti is probably going to be more specific on that, but in Italy as well, new tools are being brought to the fore. Thinking about, for example, social bonds. I'm not talking about social impact bond. Such are not in existence at the moment. The G8 task force is actually working at that to try and have social impact bonds in Italy as well. But for the time being, this is not a truism. So we're talking about social bonds as such. So banks such as Banca Prossima or UBI or other local banks such as the savings banks of Rimini, Karim, have already started that, and San Patrignano is a social purpose activity. The foundation San Patrignano is active with social bonds as it is with microcredit. In Italy, we can boast a good general law, but without the adequate implementation measures. So we still do not know who are the counterparts basically that can be at work in the field of microcredit. So banks are certainly not doing much, exception made for Banca Prossima certainly, but it is only 2% of the banks that delivers microcredit for the time being. Microcredit, as a matter of fact, would be a perfect leverage, because every 100 people receiving microcredits, microloans, over 200 jobs are generated. So again, this is powerful leverage. One company out of 10 in Italy is the result of microloans, and in Italy that percentage is equal to 0.8, just because we don't have the tools to create the environment for microcredit. Morganti is going to talk about crowdfunding. Well, San Patrignano Foundation is doing something with crowdfunding itself. There's a piece of legislation which refers to that. Crowdfunding is the collection of deposit by means of technology platforms without any kind of brokerage or intermediation. It works with loans and not with investments, not with equity for the present point in time. So there are still gaps that are to be filled. There are still deficiencies that are to be tackled. There's certainly an important attention to be devoted by the government to the world of social purpose activities. A useless piece of law was passed to the benefit of social purpose activities, but the new government has adopted another measure and our social purpose activities are going to get closer to the community interest companies in the UK or to the non-profit companies in the USA. enabling the social purpose activities to widen up scope for action that at the moment is very limited. A social purpose activity may only be active in a very limited number of fields, whereas it should be measured not on the field where it is active, but rather on the mass it generates. Investors should be free to invest, getting also some profits, thus inviting also the good positive finance to actually invest with social purpose activities. And they should also be allowed to be represented within the ruling board, in the boards. So an important attention is being devoted by the government to such issues because, again, much is at stake at the moment. Many laws are being discussed. The social purpose activities should be actually the addressee of all the funding activity that Professor Salamon has shed light on. So this piece of legislation, hopefully, with all its decree, should probably be adopted before the end of the next year, or in the next 12 months. Now, before I close, just one last note. I can certainly say that the present government has been working for this piece of legislation. This recent legislation refers also to incentives for the third sector. So we still have to identify a way to reward those who invest in this. I believe that a liberalization is in order for the deductions of the money which is donated, and there's an important bill by Binis Maghi that would be neutral to that because it would shift the taxation on the beneficiary of the donation. In that case, you would donate whatever you wish, and that money would be neutral to the state in terms of taxation, because the taxation would be paid on the money received by the recipient, basically, without any limits. And this is actually... This would be actually the case because the state cannot pay for a number of services at the moment. As for the VAT, for example, in San Patrignano, for example, we pay €1 million of VAT that we cannot get back in any way, because San Patrignano is a non-profit company delivering public utility services, making the state save €32 billion. So it is a total paradox that we should be asked to pay VAT. This is an absurdity. Let me conclude going back to something that has taken me quite aback. I was talking about the possibility to measures well-being indicators rather than GDP. Studies were published by the UN in the 90s and were included also by the European community, by the European Union in 2013. So I've been pretty much surprised that the European Commission, by means of Eurostat, decided to include illicit activities in the calculating the GDP. Well, the GDP certainly has an impact on our daily life. since there are a number of parameters that we have to comply with, so deficit, GDP ratio. Obviously, if you include also the illegal activities such as prostitution, drug trafficking, when calculating the GDP, cannot but disincentivate, discourage all the activities to fight against these phenomena, these crimes, really. So, France, for example, decided not to include in the GDP all activities that are carried out under obligation. Well, I hope that our government takes up a moral leadership in Europe, because this is the role that we expect it to play. What we need is a moral leadership. We need to know that we can rely on people that are not only skilled and competent, but can provide us with positive indications. Just think that when we calculate the GDP, voluntary work is only calculated for the paid work of voluntary workers. There's only a minor fragment which is included in the true voluntary work, because some 20 billion euro more would be contributed to our GDP. So I think the voluntary worker should be included in the GDP rather than drug trafficking and prostitution, what have you.
Perché, e chiudo con questo, qual è il limite? Adesso è la droga.
So, what else? Child trafficking, counterfeiting. What else? What should we expect to have in our GDP? Because then we would generate also distortions on the market. So not only is it a moral problem, but it is. Caritas in Veritate had already been referred to, and I'd like to quote it itself when Benedict XVI stated that our vision is too much focused on production and enjoyment. Well, I believe that we have to understand that life is made up of something else, something that goes beyond, as Robert Kennedy was saying. There's not just GDP. These financial tools, these social tools are quite extraordinary, and I believe we should work along these directions, along these lines, rather than destroying what is good with measures that are completely counterproductive. Thank you.
Eccomi, allora grazie anche da parte mia per questo.
Thank you very much for inviting me this year as well. Now, to contribute to common health, not to bore you, I'd like to reduce my presentation to 4 numbers. Our bank, Banca Prossima, is fortunate enough to work within a certain setting, that of the social economy. We have no other clients than those that Professor Salamon and Moratti told us about. That setting is not sterile at all. It's extremely fertile. And here come the 4 figures. When we started out 7 years ago, nobody would have ever thought where we would be able to reach. We can give or provide 30% credit more than a standard bank. Intesa Sanpaolo continues lending money to the third sector, but we, as compared to them, extend credit by 30%. So take 100 transactions. If we do 100, Intesa does only 70. And I'm just comparing our situation with our nearest cousins, so to say, not with another competing bank. If you have broadened the credit horizons so much, how can you do this? Now, this credit deteriorates only in a percentage of less than 2%. This means that only less than 2% of this credit doesn't come back. Even if the economic situation as a whole has deteriorated, credit deterioration in SMEs is much higher than this bare 2% that we have. So we can provide more credit, and this also implies that there is no credit deterioration. Another thing I like very much, and the Rimini meeting is the right place to recall this. Italy is only one. You can't talk about a 3-4 speed Italy. It would be too easy to say. But 25% of these loans are issued south of Rome. I'm quite proud of this. I don't want to generalize behaviors, but really, south of Rome, the economy has more difficulties. Public institutions have difficulties paying. The families are poorer than elsewhere. The third sector is less widespread. Instead, we have this situation in Banca Prossima, where most of the loans are issued south of Rome. Another figure, which is really the last one I'm going to mention, credit without real guarantees is 70% of the total issued by Banca Prossima. For every 100 euros we give, only 70 are guaranteed to us. So you can provide credit in a way which is different from giving credit only if you don't need it. Like in that famous movie with Benigni. And I think that the picture of Banca Prossima can be described in these 4 figures and facts. Now, talking about philanthropy, after listening the brilliant presentation by Lester Salamon, I'd like to share with you one point, the ice buckets for ALS. I think these are something great. By the way, don't know if you noticed this, but it was really the right time to use ice buckets, because this is something you'd normally do in Italy in midsummer. Instead, it was really a nice advertising idea, a nice social initiative which worked well in Italy and in the rest of the world. But when donors took action because of those ice buckets, did they have an idea what they were doing? Did they have the necessary tools to decide about donation? And what is it that is necessary to decide when to donate? Accountability is a very nice English word that we don't have in Italian. That's why we use the same. If I have to pay €5, €100 or 100,000 euro at least, I have to know 3 things. First of all, I must know whether the cause for which I'm giving money will be realized or not, because it may happen that you give a donation and nothing is put in place. Second question you ask yourself as a donor, what's the price of the fundraising campaign? There are fundraising campaigns that are more expensive than what they yield. Well, actually, it's not a failure for fundraisers only, but for the whole of society, because the raised money is wasted. There are initiatives like aggressive fundraising initiatives which yield only after the same person has donated for 3 years. So it's only after 3 years that the cost of organizing such a fundraising campaign is paid back, and this is a big problem. And then another question, of the €5 that you donate, how much of this amount is actually reaches where it should reach? We need to make a benchmarking analysis. We sometimes see that less money is raised sometimes than it should be, but simply because there is no transparency and no accountability. You can't play with the community's money. I've nothing to say against the fundraising campaign using the ice buckets. It's a brilliant idea, and certainly that money will be used in the most appropriate way. I'm simply referring to the phenomenon of fundraising, which should be characterized by transparency and accountability. Then there is a word, a concept of impact, which was also mentioned by Professor Salamon. When you donate, whether it's €1 or 100,000 euros, you should know what you donate for. Impact certification is most required. The Italians are not mean. They tend to donate little because they don't know what happens to their money, and I think it's an excellent reason not to donate. It's a prerequisite. You need to know what your money is used for. So those that ask for donations must be transparent. They have to tell us about the impact which is generated through their action. You know, we shouldn't think of an impact only with respect to donation. The stronger the impact, the more you donate. But this is also true for loans and for all other mixed tools that Professor Sullivan referred to, and also for other innovative tools that I would like to briefly mention, because sometimes we take them for granted. Instead, we should a little bit consider them more in depth. This morning I was at a meeting here in Rimini with Minister Poletti. The head of CONAI was also attending. It's the consortium which has put in place a system for separate waste collection. Thanks to CONAI, savings were achieved of 13 billion euros in 14 years. A great deal. And you know, it's also a way to protect the environment, etc. And certain situations were prevented as a consequence of this. For example, a railway wagon was not disposed of in Rotterdam. This is something that they avoided. We have avoided all those wagons bringing waste to countries abroad. This fantastic impact was achieved by the initiative by CONAI. Why did they stop there? Why wasn't it possible to obtain savings which were 10 times as much instead of 130? And the consequence drawn by the president of CONAI was that there were no funds. But if spending 10, you can save 100, wouldn't you do this in your own household? If the country had reasoned, had followed this reasoning, it would have favored all the social economy initiatives promoting separate collection. And also the social cooperatives could have taken care of this. We in Italy are very good at social cooperatives. In Rome, for example, 1,000 convicts work for cleaning the city of Rome. These are real facts, not rumors. But this has not taken place because the public expenditure system is such that you cannot adopt this diligence approach. You know, if you pay 10 and save 100, even if you have to get indebted to pay those 10, you have to, because finally you're going to save. In Italy, this is not the reasoning which is followed. It's a scandal. Instead, you know, we have situations which where we still send railway wagons full of waste abroad. We need to somehow rewrite some very simple rules of public finance. Also, this part is missing. Financial interventions which have an impact have to be introduced straight away because they will make the difference. In Italy, we don't have the financial software which makes all these operations possible. Professor Salamon at the beginning mentioned the mechanism concerning the second offenses of convicts. Abroad, there is a financial software for this. Everybody speaks about it, and some people buy this software because it's a product for the world market. You may be Swiss and buy 1,000 euros of a bond, which is based on making the British public expenditure more efficient. You know, this is really a smart mechanism. A software program which is proposed to the world against the securities and the bonds that are of the traditional economy. You know, in Italy, we have a varied scenario. We have year-long traditions linked to communities. It's not the government bonds that matter, but it's the credit title against a community. A community has to fight for a certain organization to interpret its needs, not just services. In your communities, you don't ask social cooperatives or social ventures or other organizations to give you efficiency and services. You want participation in the collective life. You want identity, a meaning, because a community certainly expresses social economy. You know, for example, the city of Florence has Misericordia, which provides community services of all types. In Tuscany, the Misericordia organization has 1.5 million members. It's a pervasive phenomenon, really collective, community-based. It's something you can't do without. This is the magic of the third sector. It's something we have to contribute to increasing, also using impact tools, which are as follows. Citizens buy a bond. They make money available. They accept a return which is rather low on that money because their goal is not to become rich. The goal is that the community manifests itself like that. So citizens accept a lower return, they transfer their money to the bank, and the bank, using this money, makes or provides funds to the third sector at a very low cost. This is a true social bond. Then there is another one which says simply you invest where you want, and then we agree that once you get an economic outcome of this, part of it will be given to X. This is a grant-based investment, but this is not what I mean. If you say, for example, the bond we're issuing will have a yield of 1 percentage point, actually, you sort of give up part of your return. You're happy with 1 percentage point, but you transfer money, and I transfer that money and convert it into loans with an equal discount. So you could have expected 3 percentage points. You are happy with 1, and I will ensure the same discount to others. With this approach, we were able to raise 40 million in 3 weeks, and in 3 months we converted all this into loans, 146 loans throughout Italy. These loans were made available at conditions that economically are not repeatable. You know, a community, among the nice things it can do is not caring about the market and the community. When you give money to your brother, for example, you don't want interest rates. There is a sort of parallelism between these two elements. If you are a bank, you have to consider risk, the cost of money, and both have to be paid. But if you're lending money to your brother who's in need, or if you're, for example, paying the costs of education for your child, well, in the future, you're not going to tell him, I paid 5 installments of the university fees, and now I want this money back with interest rates. You won't do this, and the same is true for certain communities. Are these facts, or is this wishful thinking? 4 million implementations from nursery schools to family homes, etc., and raising almost all this in the city of Naples. You know what the Neapolitans did? They funded things not only in Naples. With their money, we also funded initiatives in the north of Italy. So actually, our country is not divided. This applause is for those who are not narrow-minded. Last point, and I'll conclude. I already gave you the example of an economy which is sustainable in a different way. Let's take another case, a real one, which happened some months ago. It's not an isolated case. It's a tool which our bank uses for having financing paid not very much. If you finance at a high cost, you may be disappointed because people, families, organizations can't continue paying the interest rates which are required. So it's in the bank's interest to keep the interest rates low. It's to the advantage of the bank. And then you have the market, which is some kind of god, not allowing for any second option. The price is set and that's it. Instead, the only subject that beats the market is the communities. Following this approach, some months ago, we gave funds to a parish. They wanted to have a new oratory without architectural barriers, and the cost of it was 1 million euros. So a major restoration work. That was a lively parish school, a parish church. Lively doesn't mean that they have securities in the bank, that they can that they have assets. Lively means that they have a good relationship with their community. Since there was a lively community relationship, we were ready to give them this million euros. But a bank can only lend money under the market conditions. So the interest rate was going to be 5%, which is not bad, but it generates 50 million in interest rates every year, which may not be sustainable, plus the 1 million capital that has to be paid back. So it was in the bank's interest to find an innovative and creative solution. We told the priest, since you're able to be followed by your community, why don't they lend you the money? We guarantee the capital. The new schedule says, the faithful had to lend him money, to lend Father Marco the money. The more loans you have, the better it is. And this is also proof of the fact that the parish church functions well. So ideally, the interest rate should be 0 if you have good motivations. We will guarantee the capital and provide all the remaining capital until 1 million. Banca Prossima in this case lend 300,000 euros with 5% interest rate. We had to do this because as a bank we have to be sustainable and we have to apply that interest rate. But the interest rate is applied only to a small amount. The rest, well, half it was lent at 0 interest rate and the other half was donated. And when Lester Salamon says we should reflect on mixed philanthropy, mixing donations and loans, in this case it was people's loans following family loans, not market rules. Then you understand. I could tell you many more examples, but I appreciate we're all tired. This marvelous dream, which goes through law provisions, arid measures, in everyday life is actually a big dream that has become true. Thank you.
Abbiamo avuto
I think that this evening we had quite a comprehensive presentation. First, we had Professor Salamon, and he actually introduced the subject and he showed us that we're going through a revolutionary time, a time of change. And then we heard from Mrs. Letizia Moratti, who showed us the state of the art in terms of Italian legislation. She indeed referred to the difficulty laws show in understanding the present time situation. And then we heard from Mr. Morganti, who showed us lights and shadows of something which is already pretty much underway. So rather than having just a fruitless presentation, we had a very fruitful meeting. I see that amongst the delegates there are people that are really active in the field. In Italy, the non-profit sector probably is more mature and it is ready to interact with institutions such as Banca, Prossima, urging directions and commitments on the part of the government. Probably the third sector is more mature than the press or even the government. So something has changed. We have to take stock of that. No profit is not just voluntary work. Not for profit, as we've been told, is an activity, is some kind of business that has to coordinate itself, that has to operate together with other businesses, and this sector is generating income. And over the years, as Professor Salamon was saying, this has been the case, and these activities should be included in the GDP. And I believe that we should include again certainly the third sector rather than the crime, organized crime. Thank you.